So, hello and welcome to the Social Matters podcast. We are three social workers talking about social matters. Hi, I'm Nadia.
Hi, I'm Fran.
Hi, and I'm Eugene.
So today we're going to be having a conversation about the war in Gaza, and we're going to be having a chat about how we've sort of come to the decision to have a conversation about what's happening. We're going to be talking about some of the things that we've thought about, that we felt, and we're just gonna talk it out, aren't we? So I suppose the first thing is I think it's helpful for us to kind of give a bit of context to how we've arrived here to have this conversation, because it wasn't a straightforward road, was it? There was a bit of a journey to get here. So yeah, I suppose what would you both say about that journey and how we've arrived here today?
I guess for me, when I'm thinking about this question, a lot of the journey has been influenced by emotions. So a number of different emotions. I think concern, fear, anger, frustration in what is going on, but also in the kind of thoughts about what a conversation like this on air, on a podcast could mean for us as individuals, but combined with a need to do what we want to do on this podcast, which is start conversations. And I think we've been in situations where we first maybe started off and being like fear and worry about actually, is it our place to have this conversation? Obviously every episode, this is just in my eyes, every episode that we do gains popularity, it grows our podcast. So that kind of feeling of like, are we doing is it to do the episode to start a conversation, or is it to do the episode to grow the brand? And I didn't feel comfortable with the idea of talking about what's going on, the war in Gaza, and in a way benefiting from that. So, but I guess for me, the more and more things went on, the more and more you learn about the history and about what's been going on, the more and more you see the suffering and on people's faces and in our communities here, but you hear about the suffering of people over there. It for me, it's worth the risk, and it's a need rather than a want to have this conversation. I think it's a need to start this conversation. So that's kind of my pathway in a way.
Yeah, I think similar, I suppose, in terms of the emotion that you talk about, Huge. And then I think from that, almost like a disconnect between the conversations that we were having perhaps outside of the podcast, and then not having it on the podcast.
Yeah.
So we were talking about it as three friends, as people where there's this horrible stuff happening in the world. But then we weren't talking about it or we hadn't talked about it on the podcast. And I think that we had some questioning around that, didn't we? Around like how and why. And I think, again, connected to emotion, maybe thinking about kind of, do I know enough? Is it my place? And I think part of that journeying for all of us was, this absolutely fits with us as people and our podcast. And it felt remiss to not have a conversation. And I suppose we are coming into this space not as experts. We don't have lived experience of being in Gaza, being Palestinian, being Jewish, being Muslim, or a lot of different people who are maybe affected more directly than us. But I think it's a horrible thing that's happening on a human level, and I think that was sort of where we got to have a conversation about it. And as always, it's a conversation starter when we have these podcasts, isn't it? Of like, let's start talking about some of these feelings that it's bringing up, and then with the hope of kind of further and future conversations. So yeah, born out of feeling, but then how we were like, how do we talk about this more?
Yeah. And for me initially, sort of, after the 7th of October and in, I suppose, the rest of October, I was of a view of like, oh, I don't know enough. Like, that thing of like, I don't have the knowledge. Like, so, in that case, I'll just sit back and hold tight. And actually, that's such a challenge for us is that enough of a reason? Is that it? I started to think, is that enough of a reason? Why am I not trying to be more educated? Why am I not trying to read up more? And actually that thing of, silence being almost complicity in it, that thing of like, oh, actually, I need to be doing something and using my voice. And I've, been thinking more and more about the people in Gaza suffering and what we're being silent. Why? Because we're worried about saying the wrong thing, or the implications that it could have. That actually, it's worth the risk, and it's important to do that. The people in Gaza need us to be using our voices and to be doing something. So more and more I was kind of, we were kind of talking about it, bringing it back to each other of like, oh, team, what do we think? And that hesitation actually, I feel a bit like disappointed in myself actually for that initially. But I suppose the on the flip side, it's important to be a bit measured and come to the decision in a way where I am a bit more informed and I do have a bit more of an understanding, and trying to kind of get people to use their voices more and act. So
It's interesting you said disappointment, because I think that's the word that I'd connect with. Like, I think we've always prided ourselves on being there and having those difficult conversations, and I guess part of my reflections in this process was and connected with the notion of disappointment is thinking about how I was personally and how we were when George Floyd died. Then I went back on our Instagram and listened to some of the snippets of our episodes there, and I was like, not to big us up, but kind of blown away by the raw nature of our conversations, the emotions, the passion, the willingness to kind of commit from our experience. And I did share our lived experience from your experience, Fran, hearing it on episodes, the connection with unquestionable allyship. And the disappointment comes in to be like, well, why was my initial view to hold off? And why was my initial view to not go there with this episode and talking about the experiences of Palestinian people and just the atrocities that are happening and to groups of people and have been happening for a long, long time. And because like you said, Fran, at the beginning, we don't have those lived experiences. Those lived experiences are not present in our day-to-day, whereas race is present, queer identity is present, so we feel comfortable talking about that. But that idea of disappointment, I think that captures how I felt. But I would echo what you said, Nads, around actually I feel more equipped to have this conversation now than I did in mid-October. And I think mid-October it would have been a maybe less measured, less informed kind of Eugene coming to this conversation, whereas now I feel equipped and in a better place to have this conversation.
I agree with that as well, around kind of the time of the conversation. And I think all of us said at the beginning, didn't we, around the kind of emotive element, and that is still there. But I suppose if we're on, in the spirit of having perhaps more difficult conversations and leaning into discomfort is about being in a space to be able to kind of learn, isn't it? And I think that's where we've all definitely been over the last 6 weeks, but also being able to have a conversation that is as thoughtful and as measured as we can be. And I think that's really important when we are having these. But I think sometimes one of the things that I think we've all said, and I suppose just speaking for myself, is that kind of, it's complex. And then what can happen in that is that like, I don't feel like I don't know enough. It is complex. And I think, but we have to connect with that complexity, because I think sometimes in situations in Gaza, it feels some of the impact or some of the conversations can feel quite binary.
Yeah.
And actually we're therefore not connecting with the complexity. So I think a response to say it's complex is right, but then that shouldn't mean that it's then like, okay, so it stops there. Actually, it's nuanced. And I guess thinking about systemic and that kind of idea of both and, I think I have both things for me. Like, you know, horrible things have happened on both sides. I think it isn't a kind of either or binary. And I think there has to be that both and, like, kind of the Hamas attack, horrific. What's happening in Gaza, horrific. There is that kind of element going on. And I do wonder as well around perhaps some of the worry around the conversations is because, you know, both, you know, wider groups of people are groups that experience marginalisation and oppression. And I guess that there's that wider context that can happen in these conversations. We know Islamophobia has increased, we know anti-Semitism. And I think these are all wider contextual, broader issues that I think maybe adds an element of maybe fear or uncertainty of having the conversations and how people are able to go into a conversation checking some of those biases or unconscious biases, because I think they come out in a lot of these conversations, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. It's making me think about, you know, you were saying the binary. I was in church the other week, and my pastor was talking about the situation in Gaza, and I was like, oh my days, like how, like, because he started the sermon off with, like, you know, war forces you to choose a side, and I was like, oh my days, what's he coming with? I was so concerned, like, and actually that he spoke about, well, there is another side of, you know, peace and diplomacy and you know, negotiation, and how do we hold those positions and appreciate those positions rather than this, you know, binary kind of. So I was just thinking about, while you was talking, you know, my next question was going to be, how has the situation and the war sort of impacted you and the people around you? And I was thinking about, you know, me in my church with my kind of church family, with our pastor kind of speaking to us about positions and things that we should be doing. But yeah, that's off the back of that. What would you say have been some of the things that have impacted you and those around you?
I guess for me, it's I don't know whether it's as simple as this, but from a personal value perspective, death or killing people, there's not a justification for that. And I guess that is probably what's impacted me the most. Kind of not just the death of children, the death of families, just the death of people in general. Like, and one of my friends said this, is that the narrative is children and families and children and women dying, which is important to put forward, because I think that's what kind of connects people in an emotive way. But men are also dying, and they are people, and to say that it's okay for anybody to die is quite concerning for me. That is a narrative that is a bit of an untold story, by kind of like, and we've just gone past November 15th, and a lot of MPs didn't vote for the ceasefire or abstain, and the untold or the untellable story in that kind of vote is that it's okay to kill people. It's okay for people, like, and people who say, yeah, this is a part of war, casualties are important, and maybe from where they're coming from in their field, that connects with their values. But for me, like, I struggle to kind of accept that, and that's probably what's affected me the most or one of the things that's affected me the most in this what's going on with the war in Gaza. And one of the things that I feel that is a real struggle is people's ability to empathise in those situations, because if this was happening on my doorstep, if the kids on the street who I see playing out whenever the sun's out, round my car, round the bins, being creative with what they find out, if those are, I don't know those kids, I don't talk to those kids, but I have a connection with them because I see them, I walk past them, I say hello most days. These kids playing in these ways, they're the same kids playing in Gaza. The shopkeeper who's friendly and asks you questions where you're buying your milk, that person exists in Gaza. Your tutor at school, that person exists in Gaza, and in all of these places where wars going on. podcasters like us exist there. So, but this ability or unconscious action to distance ourselves from other human beings is incredibly concerning. And I think if empathy was one of our leading steps when we think about what's going on in places where there is war, where there are conflicts, then I think we'll be leading more down the road of compassion and peace. But to say that a life is justified for the grand goal of a particular side or whatever, from a personal perspective, I struggle with that, and that's one of the reasons why I think how I've been affected by what's going on.
Yeah. Similar to me, I suppose it's made me think more broadly about war. And, you know, we talk a lot about language on this podcast, and that there's a whole rhetoric and language about the rules of war. And I'm just like, what, you know what I mean? Like, let's have a humanitarian ceasefire to let some water into people who are being absolutely, you know, bombarded every day. It's horrific. I'm like, a ceasefire full stop. But then also the language of kind of, you know, people are allowed to defend themselves. It's like the fact that we even have that written into kind of humanitarian laws just feels bizarre. That there are rules of war. How about, and I know it feels like, you know, people be like, oh, come on, Fran, you know, but it's reality. How about we just don't even have it?
Yeah.
It's really made me think about just being a pacifist. And I know there's that, like, well, it is what it is, but it's just, you know, all societal ills about power, about greed, like, I just, all of that, and reading about that there are these rules just feels bizarre, but also abhorrent around power. And it's sort of, it makes you think of like playground style behavior, but actually it's lives and it's reality. And I think it's hard for the brain to process, isn't it? Like, the thousands and thousands of people that have been killed, and then, you know, it's I think it's been that of like unable to process it. And I think with that can come some guilt, can't it? Of like, oh, I can't, like, we have the privilege of choosing whether we engage in it. And I've definitely been at times like, I actually can't. But then even that, and then I kind of go through that, like, okay, no, I need to do more. I need to have a conversation. This is horrific. So yeah, I think it's made me think about war. It's made me think about how bizarre it is. And, you know, that we just need to stop it. And as you said, I guess you're like passed around, like, can we just talk more?
Yeah.
Which, you know, is so important. And yeah, like, have a ceasefire. It is so unequal and horrific. So yeah, and then just thinking about the sad reality of, what's going on and the language around it.
Yeah, you spoke about the vote for the MP. I emailed my MP and I was disappointed to say that, because I got a response and I was like, whoa, they've responded to me. And then I read what they did or didn't do, and I was just like, I don't understand. The other thing I was thinking about, you both kind of said war, and I know, you know, this episode we said we're speaking about Gaza, but there is war happening, you know, elsewhere in the world, and in Sudan and in the Congo and other places. And I was thinking about how, again, the thing of like untold stories. Well, why is it we're not hearing it so much about what's happening in those places? And war is war is war. Like, it's not okay. So yeah, just while you were speaking, I was just kind of making those connections of different things happening across the world.
And I agree with that, and I think the hope in these situations, I think, is that it will shine more of a spotlight on people's desire to educate themselves around everything that's going on around the world, because we have to kind of, and we talk a lot in on this podcast about context as well, and I think context kind of creates meaning or creates what our focus is on. And I remember I went on holiday with some friends to Turkey in mid-October, and I was just looking at the difference in my algorithms on Twitter, on YouTube ads, on different social media platforms of the way that the story of what's going, or the war in Gaza, the way that story was being told in a predominantly Muslim country compared to how it was with regards to ads, what's on my Twitter feed and stuff like that here. And that's a real kind of example of how context creates meaning. So for somebody in Sudan right now, how much do they know about what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in Gaza? So I think we have to think about the context we're in, and situation like this makes me realize and connect with the fact that I have to almost teleport myself out of this context and go into other contexts, because the people who control the narrative, the social media, not social media, the general media, they control the narrative so that it makes people only tune into certain amounts of information or information from a certain perspective. That's why I think education is important. That's why I think alternative voices are important. And that's why I think social media is important, because in a way you can go and find what you want to find, and your algorithm, what comes up on your stream, on your feed, is affected by what you like and your own. Look at me explaining social media like people don't know. But I think that's important, because back in the day, it will be tuned into BBC News at 10 o'clock by the mainstream right-wing newspapers, and that is how you know what's going on in the world. So your mindset is always going to be filtered into one direction. But now we can go and find out what's happening in Sudan and in the Congo and in Ukraine and in Gaza, whereas I don't think we would have been able to find that out 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, and I guess that was one thing for all of us in having this conversation today, wasn't it, around the importance of education? And, none of us kind of know everything about it. And I think I've tried to read up on kind of different sources, opinion pieces, because I think that is also really important as well. Because it's also not to assume that everyone on different sides is a kind of, a monolith either with just one view. I think it's really important that we do hear from different people with different perspectives, to try and come from more reliable sources as well. And I think even, and I'm still educating myself, I think the one thing that I've landed on is I guess, the overall impact of war and the loss of life and impact on civilians. And I think that's the bit where it's kind of like that's something that I know on a human level really bothers me, and it's just so significant, and it's daily and it's ongoing, and I think that's been the biggest impact.
Yeah. So in terms of having difficult conversations, which I suppose that's something that we speak a lot about on this podcast, how to think about and have difficult conversations. How has it been? One, I suppose, having this conversation, but two, how has it been to have the conversations with the people that you're with in your day-to-day, in your family, your friends, work, about what's happening in Gaza?
In terms of the conversation, I suppose similar to today, which has been with a level of, I think you were maybe going to say it, caution, and kind of not wanting to upset or offend. But the conversation has been there. So I guess it has been present. And I think I suppose it's like in any difficult conversation, almost setting, warming the context, as we say, and setting the scene for it, of like wanting to know more, wanting to kind of understand, good intent, but also, also mindful of impact, and trying to have a conversation that's based on what I've been reading, but also to learn more, to keep educating myself. But it's also that thinking about, okay, where are my values on this? And, that's something that is, I suppose speaking for myself, but I know when we've spoken around the loss of life of innocent people and civilians, that's something where you're like, even if I don't feel wholly read up or confident in certain areas, I know that bothers me.
Yeah.
And I think that's been where I've landed.
Yeah, similar ideas when thinking about a cautious approach, and not having the knowledge or finding the need to educate myself in order to have these conversations, but also not, like you said, Fran, not wanting to offend people, but also with me, like thinking about checking in with people, and also not feeling that it's my, in a way, it's my right to do that. Like, who am I? But also at the same time, knowing that it's going to be impacting on people, especially people who have direct connections with that part of the world from an Israeli Jewish perspective, but also thinking about the Arab world and Muslim people as well. Wanting to kind of check in with people, but finding it difficult to have these conversations because of not having the knowledge, and not feeling educated, but also kind of understanding the complexity of this, and that it runs back so many years, and we talk about what happened on October 7th, but this has been going on for a lot longer than that. And before October 7th, is in my mind, I have an understanding, but I don't have a detailed enough understanding. It's not my lived experience. I'm not thinking about it day to day. So it makes it harder or more difficult to have the conversation with people now, because it feels like I'm just being parachuted into this discussion because of the atrocities that have happened since and including October 7th. But for me, as time has passed, feeling that it's important to have this conversation, and it's important to not to get rid of the kind of cancel culture mentality that people have, in the fear of, like, if I say something wrong, then I'm going to be cancelled in this personal relationship, in this group setting, or on social media. So I'm just not going to go there. And actually, my own personal values is that mistakes have to be made. People will disagree with what you say. People may be listening to this conversation starter and being like, what do you guys know? You don't know anything, and thinking that we're talking nonsense. And that's okay. And I think that's where I've transitioned when thinking about having conversations with people in my personal life, but also here, is that actually I need to own what I don't know and accept that what you're going to say is not going to be the flavour of the month for absolutely everyone, but it's important to have these conversations.
Yeah. When you were talking about the kind of reaching out to friends or impacted more directly, I've definitely done that on both, and I did have that dilemma of like how to say it or what to say, but I think I just sort of landed on a how are you, and I think that's something that's just like, you're not, I don't know everything about it, but just that checking in is really important. But yeah, there was definitely that like initial like, oh, not quite knowing, but actually something, say something. So yeah.
For me, I think I've really appreciated you both in helping me kind of process everything that's been happening. And in terms of the question around difficult conversations, I suppose there were times, especially initially, when I was having conversations where I felt a bit like, I don't know, like being spoken into helplessness, or being talked into like, I'm helpless. I can't do nothing. What can I do? And I remember seeing something like. It was like a quote of like, I don't know, I'm only one person, what can I do, said 7 billion people.
Yeah.
Like, and I was like, oh, that's a great challenge, but I suppose thinking about the difficult conversations, I was just kind of noticing what I was talking myself into in terms of like being helpless, when like there's some things that can be done. So I think the difficult conversation, I suppose that transition from not doing anything into then talking in some way is in some way moving things along, which just kind of looking back over the journey of me having conversations about this over the time, it's definitely sort of evolved from not wanting to say anything to actually maybe I can say something, and we should say something. So yeah,
And I really like that idea of challenging that idea of I can't say anything, or what I say may not impact. And I think for me, it's about doing something to move the needle just a little bit. So all you need to do is move it one dial, not need to make seismic change, because maybe we're not those people, that person who can make those seismic change, as demonstrated with the vote for a ceasefire, and we all wrote to our MPs and we all got responses. But if that action moves the needle a little bit, this conversation we're having now moves the needle a little bit in the sense of empowering other people to have similar conversations, then that is a part of us doing our bit. But I think sometimes when people feel that they can't make huge change, they retreat into not doing anything. So yeah, I definitely agree with that point, Neds.
Yeah, so we're just coming to the end of this conversation now. What would you say are some of your takeaways from having this conversation?
For me, it's a takeaway that is got me kind of thinking from this discussion we have had now, rather than a specific part of this discussion. And for me, is the notion of allyship and knowing that if something bad is happening to other people, you should do something, say something, and that is a way of allyship. All oppressions are linked, so you can't just think about, okay, let me just talk about what affects me directly. I need to go and talk about things that affect other people. And again, we rinsed that Maya Angelou quote, but the idea of when you know better, do better. So yeah, that's probably my takeaway.
Mm-hmm. I think similar, building on that, around, I guess, the conversation we had earlier about our journeying here, of actually, self-educate, read, do something. I think that's been our journey of kind of leaning into that discomfort. And yes, we might not know everything, but conversation starter, a willingness to kind of understand more and try and do something. And as you said, that kind of something is better than nothing.
Mm-hmm. For me, my takeaway has been just appreciating you both, and having, I don't think I'm always fully switched on to how much you help me kind of process my thinking and my feelings, and just, I suppose, to the viewers and the listeners, to find your people that help you do that. If it might just be one other person, but somebody to kind of help be a bit of a soundboard and help you to kind of process your thoughts and feelings on difficult things, on not necessarily just difficult things, on things in life. Just really appreciate the both of you, so thank you. So we have been 3 social workers talking about social matters. Thank you for tuning in. If you would like to follow us on social media, we are on Instagram at Matters Podcast. We're also on Facebook, the Social Matters Podcast. We're also on YouTube. Do find us there. And we're also on X. It feels weird to say X, but we're on X at the Social Matters Podcast. Thank you so much. Please do like, please do share, and please do come back. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.